this is the first time tuning into one of our Genus live streams. For those of you that are not in the know-how, we generally start these streams off with some Genus news, updates of what's been going on around the brewery, around the shop, new toys that we might have, new videos that might be coming your way. We then transition into some form of a beer of the week, which we give you a breakdown of usually a BJCP style and kind of give you the ins and outs about it and how you might brew it yourself. And then finally we go into a discussion topic or two, which today we will be talking about lager fermentation schedules and nice, colorful, and flavorful base malts that might not be on your radar. So
yeah. So let's go in and go on to some Genus Brewing news. We didn't write anything down, but I guess we can probably riff because, that's the thing that
I
happens.
haven't actually been here all week, so.
Logan's been gone all week.
That's why I was like, I'm going to leave that for Peter.
So we got our strawberry basil seltzer on tap. We are almost done with our seltzer fermentation.
I did see those. Those were looking beautifully clear back there.
Yeah, the one that's the clearest is actually the proper with the Lutra.
Interesting.
So
right.
yeah,
well, there you go. I mean,
we've got our French saison with it, I guess. So we've got the nutrient schedule is actually a really big reason behind clarification in seltzers. So we got the 4-way seltzer experiment coming out. We did a live stream on our second channel yesterday where Ryan and I took the Cicerone level 1 certification test. So Ryan is now legally allowed to serve beer, which is pretty cool. If you haven't already tuned into our second channel and subscribed to that, please do. Our Willet beers are going to be moving over to that channel so we can see if they can get a little bit more traction on a channel that's more focused on entertainment and less focused on education. And what else do we do? We kegged our Pilsner. So we have a Czech style Pilsner that will be on tap later on today.
Ooh, that sounds delicious.
I'm excited for it.
So yeah, because we always like to tap a Pilsner during snowstorms.
Exactly.
That's how when we did that perfect Pilsner video. It was the same thing.
Yep.
It's like nasty snowstorm.
It's the best time to do it. The coldest time of the year. It'll be even better if we make a lot of it and then it's still here for the summer. Yeast and the Beast asks, how do breweries make yeast starters? We just do them in very big vessels.
Yeah, cone to cone a lot of times for the bigger guys.
Yeah, I actually bought a 14-gallon unitank just for that reason. All right, let's get into our beer of the week. Bum, 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 beer of the week. Beer. Nailed it.
And that is BJCP 2015 style guideline, Vienna Lager category 7A under European Amber Bitter Lagers. Amber Bitter European Beer. There we go. Wow.
Yeah, they 2015 did us dirty.
It's all right.
Naming everything the wrong things. That's right. And the Vienna Lager is in that same realm of the sessionable European or sessionable German beers, along with like a Fest beer and Oktoberfest. Like all those kind of fall into the same general, really easily drinkable lagers that kind of span that color spectrum a little bit.
Yeah, it's actually its cousin. Style is actually an Oktoberfest or Märzen, and really the impressions of a Vienna lager that you should notice is that while it shares some similarities, it's actually even lighter, crisper, and a bit more sessionable, and a lot of that does come from the hops as well. So a moderate strength beer. ABV is actually probably going to be similar. What is the ABV on these guys? 4.7 to 5.5, so slightly less compared to something like a Märzen. But you got to pay attention to the IBUs on these, which are 18 to 30. So for being a light, crispy lager, this is actually fairly bitter beer. Hence why it falls into this category. So otherwise, should have a very, very clean, rich, bready, and to some degree toasty profile with just a really nice, elegant head. Moderate carbonation on this one.
Yeah, so not high carb like a lot of the German pilsners.
So not high carb like a lot of the pilsens, exactly. And really kind of keeping things simple with it, which goes to say for most German lagers, most German beers in general. And kind of not going heavy on the adjuncts. A lot of American versions do that, but that's definitely not the traditional way of doing things.
As of today, some level of acceptability is there for caramel malts, but as you know, we're probably not going to put those in our recipes. But if you happen to, and it has a touch of that caramel color, a color from the caramel malts, that's acceptable. You really don't want to be tasting caramel or roast at all in these styles.
Yeah. I'll talk about some of those malts later, but
Yeah. All right, so let's go into our malt of the week. We used Best Wiener. Best Wiener is the best of all the wieners, and it's just the perfect base malt for this style of beer because Wiener is in the name.
it is my go-to Wiener.
Yeah, mine too.
That's
I can put a lot of Best Wiener in my mouth.
So yeah, to no surprise, Vienna malt, or even sometimes to a degree a sort of more mild Munich malt, I suppose.
Yeah, and a lot of German Munich malts do come in at that like 6 level bond range, whereas Vienna malts in America can come up to 6 and down to like 3. So
yep, and those are going to make up to 100% of your grain bill. Actually, generally you're going to see very little adjuncts in here. So Vienna malts is going to make up a big part of it. You might be doing a decoction mash if you want to really go traditional. Otherwise, I wouldn't hesitate to actually blend these together. Maybe go something like 70% Vienna and 30% Munich.
Idaho Farmhouse says, "Good morning, lads. I'm a little late. Had to plow." Nice, Idaho Farmhouse.
Oh gosh.
Good job getting some this morning.
Yeah.
I assume that's what he meant.
Yeah, nope.
Okay. But yeah, basically trying to balance the color that you want out of your Vienna Lager with a combination of base malts is our favorite way to achieve that color because it's going to keep that beer nice and crisp and, have some complexity in the malt character, but not turn into that kind of sweetness. Because this is supposed to be a sessionable beer that leans on that brightness.
Yeah, I do highly recommend doing a step mash if it's viable for you. That'll just really help create that crispness without adding too much chewiness to the beers. Basically, at least doing some kind of a protein rest in there at some point in time. That's just going to help that beer from getting too thick on you.
Never going to hurt muffins.
Yeah, too much body. Because the whole point is you want a really sessionable beer out of these. Color-wise, like Peter's saying, you're shooting for 9 to 15 SRM, which will get you in that really nice, anywhere from like a sort of dark golden color all the way down to kind of approaching that nice sort of rosy amber.
Yeah, medium amber range. But the amber is always going to come across as like the orangey side of the amber, and not that rich, deep red side of the amber that you can get from like using a lot of crystal malts.
So that's what you're going to be shooting for. That's
you know what? Red X would be a fun one that we could have put in there.
See, and
if we wanted that color, we'll throw that in there. We'll talk about that in the later.
I mean, we can talk about it now, actually. So the reason why I would not go Red X, actually, is just because of the biscuitiness of it.
It is, it's a higher biscuit kind of content.
It's got a really high biscuit content, more so than even a light Munich, in my opinion. Yeah. And I definitely think
somewhere between a Munich and like a Victory.
I think that could overwhelm the simpleness of the beer. I mean, I'm not saying that you can't put it in, but I wouldn't do more than a pound
% or something like that. I could still see it. But if you want that red color that's on there, I was just thinking about the color of how it always does come across as the orangey side of of that redness instead of the red side. And I was like, well, if you really wanted the red side, I guess Red X could probably be a way to do it too.
Yeah. The main thing is you don't want to get overly toasty, overly roasty on here. You really just want the nuances of the malt to shine through.
And one of the reasons that you want those malts to be relatively underwhelming, I'm going to say, is because it's supposed to lean a little bit towards the hoppy side too. It's going to have a little bit of bitterness that helps make it sessionable and makes you want to keep going back for more drinks.
Speaking of hops, Steering Golding, just sort of ace in the hole out of there. Actually, I think it mentioned it in the description.
Oh, yeah?
So I want to be creative, but at the same time,
Steering Golding is the classic Belgian style hop because it goes really well with a lot of malt-forward beers, a lot of beers that have natural fruity esters, which this is not. But this hop, what it does for this style of beer is it actually keeps it in that sessionable range. It has a subtle sweetness. The earthiness isn't overly earthy. The grassiness isn't that lemony grassy that you get off of like a Saaz. So it's not going to be as aggressive as like a Kent Golding or as peppery and lemony as like a Saaz. But it is one of those old world hops that's kind of a go-to. So common hops that are similar to that are going to be like Fuggles and Willamette in that semi-sweet range.
Yeah, they this is actually described a lot as being like a more refined form of Fuggle, which is actually, I guess, its mother plant, from what I read.
I think it's the other way around. I thought they were maybe sisters.
Could be wrong. Yeah, somebody was saying it was related to Fuggle in one way or another. So a really nice refined version of Fuggle can give you a very, very subtle white peppery note, which like Peter says goes really well in Belgians, but also I think can really help balance an otherwise malty beer. Yeah, and you're going to be bittering this pretty heavily because these guys are low in alphas. You're looking at generally only 1.5 to 3% alphas, so somewhere in those mid twos range is what you're looking at. So you're probably going to have to bitter this. For a 5-gallon batch, you're probably going to be looking at about 2 ounces or so.
Maybe even 3, depending on the bittering holdings.
Yeah, depending on some we have seen them well below 2 sometimes. You're going to load it up with bittering, but as for the end, you want those malt aromas to come through. So I would recommend really, really restraining yourself on any late additions. If you really feel like it, maybe throw in a ½ ounce at 10 minutes or something like that. But I honestly don't think any late addition is necessary for this style. I'm
on the same page there. In terms of the yeast of the week, we went with Omega's German Lager OAL 109, which is the same as the Y yeast 3208. It's the Munich Lager strain. And we chose this one because it has a really good balance of having that clean lager profile, but being slightly malt leaning.
Yeah, so so it's just kind of finding that give and take balance of bitterness versus maltiness. And this is going to push forward those malt flavors, those aromatics that are going to be coming through. It's a traditional style, it's a Munich lager, right? So it's going to be a little bit sulfury at times, which means that you might have to do a more traditional lagering schedule. There we go. That's what I was going for. You see what I did there? A little foreshadowing.
Yeah.
And or just give it a little bit of an extended VDK rest. So I think that would be a really nice choice. Otherwise, really any of your German lager choices will produce a nice Vienna lager for you.
If you don't have that temperature control, if you can't do a proper lager schedule, something like the 3470 is a go-to classic strain that works for any German or even American style lagers. That's the OG beast. Or if you want to get super crazy, you can do a pseudo Vienna with Lutro, because why not?
That strain just never stops impressing us.
It is a beast. Let's talk
a
little bit about water chemistry.
Am I talking about it?
Do you want to go for it?
Yeah, I'm gonna get you started, and I guess you can you can.
So this one you got carbonated. It has less. It's decarbonated because of how these were brewed originally. Meaning that although their water profile is relatively similar to what we have here in Spokane, and would be normally semi-high to high bicarbonate in that 200 ppm range, it actually is slaked out a little bit, so you get that reduced to 80 or under. A lot of people have seen this decarbonation method, even just in their boil kettle, heating up their strike water. You'll notice that you'll get some white powder in the bottom of your kettle. That's that calcium and bicarbonate dropping out.
Yeah, exactly. So slaking is a really old school process, and it's something that, as far as I know, is very common, and that's been done, since the formation of a Vienna lager. And it's just because if you don't decarbonate that water, you will end up with a really, really chalky, sharp minerality to the beer, which anyone that's had a Vienna lager does not notice that in there. That's a pretty common sort of thing that people think that they do there. But otherwise, starting off with that hard water profile, decarbonating your total dissolve or your total bicarbonates down to about 80-ish ppm. It can go a little bit lower, but generally not much. But you are going to keep a high amount of dissolved calcium, right around that 75, 80 ppm. A little bit of magnesium and sodium isn't going to hurt at all, right around 10 ppm for those guys. And then you're shooting for an overall sulfate to chloride ratio of about 2 to 3 to 1. Not quite like West Coast craziness, but you do want to balance that towards that kind of hop bitterness a little bit more. So I threw out 15 ppm of chloride and 40 ppm of dissolved sulfates, which are actually both very low.
So overall, it's going to be a pretty low mineral profile, low mineral load. The calcium is going to help with clarity on the back end, which is always nice, and then those sulfates are just going to help brighten things up a little bit. Being both low in sulfates and chlorides, it'll end up being pretty neutral, just slightly hop leaning because there is magnesium in malt as well, but it is going to help it keep bright and not lean into towards that malty sweetness like some other German beers can be.
Yeah, exactly. So if you do happen to be in Spokane, other than maybe throwing a gallon or two of distilled water into your mash and like the slightest pinch of calcium sulfate, then yeah, you actually already have a fantastic base water source to work with. So,
and it's a really good idea to also throw lobsters in this beer because the shellfish will help with clarity. So just a necessary thing that you guys need to do.
Alrighty. Well, yeah, otherwise, to just round this up, let's talk about some non-traditional, more American examples. What's the one that always comes to mind?
Dos Equis.
Dos Equis and the Negro Modelo.
Negro Modelo, yeah.
Yeah, which, so those ones are sort of Americanized examples that use higher levels.
We chose 2 Mexican lagers for Americanized.
Yeah, Americanized.
It is.
Well, because it's for the American market, let's be real.
Yeah, and it's also probably brewed in America.
Yeah.
I know at least one of those is brewed in California.
So those more modern styles are going to be sweeter than a traditional Vienna lager, and they're going to have more adjuncts, sometimes even like some corn adjuncts, but also either some caramel malts, and I know like Negro Modelo actually uses some heavily roasted malts, and we're talking about stupidly small amounts, something like a Carafa 3 at like 1 ounce or a half ounce per a 5-gallon batch. So really, really small amounts. They're basically just using those for color. And so if you want to get that extra sweetness, it's not necessarily out of style, but it's certainly not traditional either. So, all right. Well, that sums up our Vienna Lager.
I forgot to hit brew on my coffee machine.
Oh, sad day, sad day. Speaking of lagers, though, let's go into how we would. Are we going to start with the traditional way of doing it?
Yeah, so lager...
Yes, traditional way of lagering.
Yeah, so lager fermentation schedule is very yeast dependent. That said, however, there is kind of a consistent theme for how you should ferment all lagers with a traditional lager yeast. The exceptions would be things like Lutra, like 3470 if you want to ferment that warm the entire time. But if you do start it off cold, you can follow the same schedule and have a fantastic effect. Things like California lager yeast, the Anchor lager yeast, those don't necessarily need to follow this, but a lot of the other traditional lager strains will benefit really, really well from following this schedule.
So, yeah, so these are going to be strains, your Munich lager strains like what we mentioned, your Bavarian lager, your Oktoberfest strains. Those are all strains that tend to hold a little bit more true to style, and you're going to want to do a colder fermentation with these. Generally in the range of 50 to 55 degrees is what most of these guys will like, and traditionally you're going to do about a 3 to 4 week fermentation in that range before bringing it up to a VDK rest around 70 degrees Fahrenheit for just a few days, and then dropping that temperature back down to about 39 degrees and doing an extended 6-week lager with them. So
I have an optional third step in this. We'll talk about these as we kind of go through them, but I do have an optional third step. A lot of people will skip right down to that crash step where they're lagering at cold temperatures, 39 or below. If you want to get a nice conditioning step, dropping it back down and sitting it right at that 48 or just a little bit below for a couple of weeks as well. That's a conditioning step where the yeast can still be active. And so if the yeast is still active, that can sometimes act to smooth out some flavors before that crash and brightening step. When we go to step 1, so before we add our yeast, one of the first important things when it comes to starting your fermentation, when you get that beer down to your 48 to 54 degrees, somewhere in that range, is you can oxygenate a lot at this temperature, which is really nice because your yeast really need it.
Yeah. So everybody talks about higher pitch rates, keeping your lager yeast healthy, because at those lower temperatures, their metabolism, wow, I almost got that out.
Metastasizable.
So their metabolism is going to be a lot slower, which just means that they're not going to be nearly as vigorous as, a lot of ales that you might be fermenting, but giving them plenty of oxygen to start with will help them out to a better start. And like Peter said, at lower temperatures, you can actually dissolve more oxygen into the beer, which plays to your benefit, which is, I guess, one side to, because I know some people will say, pitch warm and then cool it off over 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that pitching on the cold side is better in a sense because you get more oxygen dissolved into the beer.
Yeah, pitching warm is a technique basically to get your yeast kind of active and cheat out of that super heavy pitch, super oxygenated wort. If you do pitch warm, there's more energy in the system, and that more energy in the system makes your yeast more active. If you pitch cold, you do need to have that extra oxygen, and you do need to have a really proper pitch, but it is the better way if you have all that control to do it.
So yes, oxygen, number 1, and then so step 2. Well, I guess other than the fermentation.
So step 1, so fermentation is going to last between 5 and 10 days at that first step. And this is going to be temperature dependent. And so if you're doing the whole thing at 48 degrees, that rock bottom temperature that your yeast can handle, I would err on that longer side, 10 days, maybe even a little bit longer. But be checking on your beer to make sure you know where it's at. If you're doing on that higher side, that 54, it can be as little as 5 days, and you'll notice a difference.
Yeah. And I've done, it's going to depend on your pitch rate. It's going to depend on the beer that you're brewing. I mean, I've done a Doppelbock that I've let just sit in primary, like, it was under my house, so I think it was actually it was like 45 degrees under there, and I just let it go for like 6 weeks, and that would turned out beautifully.
That would be a good thing in lieu of an actual. So I guess this is kind of like if you're trying to get it out on a schedule, on a time.
Yes.
How to do it. If you just let a beer sit until it's done. That's
and it just sat there and just chugged along and did its thing, and I never did actually give it a VDK rest. But when you have that really, really long extended primary fermentation, that's happening. It's just happening over the course of weeks instead of days.
Exactly. One thing that I'll note is that on that 48 to 54 degrees, I don't really notice a difference in a lot of those lager yeasts in terms of how neutral the beer comes across.
No, yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's just it's more a temp control thing, if you've got, it's the beauty of a winter, I guess, is that a lot of times you've got a space that you're like, oh yeah, that's cold back there. Let's throw lager and see what happens.
Yeah. So a lot of people are like, I want to get that right at 48 degrees. And I personally probably err on the 54 just because that more energy in the system is going to help out a little bit, and it's going to make it a faster process. Do what you want to do, but I personally haven't noticed a difference in flavor with that.
So, but yeah.
All right, going on to the VDK rest now.
VDK rest. So this is actually important if you are trying to turn over a lager a little bit quicker. So VDK, you guys have probably heard this before, vicinal diketone, and this is what's going to make sure that you don't have any pentane-dione, which is a sort of sweet honey-like meaty flavor in the beer, or diacetyl, which is that classic sort of butterscotched fake butter popcorn flavor. And these are produced during fermentation, and when you're fermenting a lager cold, these don't necessarily get readily absorbed by the yeast right away. And that's why towards the end of fermentation, warming that beer up will actually help those yeast become more active and reabsorb all these precursors, which makes sure that you don't have any of that in the final product.
Yeah, and it has an ancillary benefit too, especially if you're trying to get this out on a schedule of getting that beer back warm again so the yeast becomes more active. At this point, most of your fermentation should be done, and so you're not really risking getting a lot of those fruity off flavors that can come from fermenting lager yeast on the warm side. And so getting a VDK rest can make sure that your yeast is going to clean up the beer and fully attenuate it, because if you were to just crash back down at that point without doing a VDK rest, you also run the risk of just having an under attenuated beer. So it does that. If you have your beer at a conical, which is kind of ideal for this style of beer, at this point it's really nice to also CO2 yeast rouse. So bubble CO2 up through your cone. Make sure you get that yeast back into suspension while you're warming it up. Make sure it's heavily active when it goes through that VDK rest.
Yeah, that's it's one thing to note too with conicals is those versus a dish bottom fermenter with lagers is giving it at least one, if not a couple rouses throughout the process will really help that beer mature faster, and that just has to do with the surface area of the beer that's in contact with the yeast when you're talking about a cone versus a dish bottom.
It's designed to push that yeast down and crash it out, whereas the dish bottom is designed to be like, oh, you can ferment. Honestly, the old school way of making a lager would be in like a really wide kind of vessel, but
honestly, like a bucket fermenter if you got it.
Yeah, but
you can seal it up well and put it in.
We're in the commercial world. We're in the new age, so we've got to work with the technologies we've got.
Yeah. So, all right. So, and then finally, we've got the ramp down, which Peter kind of already talked about. allowing the beer to condition in sort of that mid-temperature range, sort of a cellaring range for a couple weeks.
And a lot of people skip that step, let that cellaring step. I'm superstitious, and I think it gives that creamier texture to the beer.
Yeah.
But I've had plenty of beers that went straight into crash. The biggest thing about going straight into crash, I think, and it's very, very beer dependent, but the beer ends up being a little bit brighter, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But that crash temperature does sharpen up your beer a little bit. And so probably maybe even better for like Pilsners and stuff like that.
Yep.
But, for otherwise low final gravity beers, like really dry beers, a little bit of that conditioning smoothness isn't going to hurt muffins.
I can even see it on high gravity beers too. Beers that are designed to be aged a little bit. Speaking of something like a Doppelbock or what's the one I'm thinking of? Porter, Baltic Porter. There we go.
The Baltic Porter.
So yeah, I can see those styles. Honestly, even doing a slightly warmer, not necessarily going all the way down with your lagering temperatures and doing more of a cellar temp to pseudo lager them out. So all right. And then lastly, lager literally means just to store cold. So
get into kegs. And here's one thing for anybody out there who's still bottle conditioning that they don't really realize is that a lot of times they want to crash and then get into bottles, and that's not my favorite way to do it. I would just go ahead and bottle right off your primary and then do that step in your bottles. Like do that conditioning or that lagering, that storage temperature after it fully carbonates in the bottles, not giving your yeast time to crash out before the bottles. And then that storage, that lagering can happen in the bottles just fine. Your yeast will sandwich to the bottom. You'll get that cakey yeast, and then when you pour your beer into a glass, it'll be crisp, bright beer.
For sure. I personally, I think lagering works, at least more traditional lagering works better when you have some yeast that's still in the beer. Before, I feel like the benefits of it aren't nearly as significant if you do a really good job crashing your beer out, right, and it's crystal clear going into the keg before you lager it. I honestly feel like having a little bit of yeast going into that keg, going into the say you want to lager it in a bright tank or whatever, I think having that yeast in there actually helps because there's a lot of biological processes that are still happening when you have that yeast in there.
John, number one fan, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, John.
I appreciate the super chat.
Woohoo. All right.
Ooh, coffee's done.
Coffee's done.
That is it for our topic number one. If you guys got any questions, feel free to leave them. If we don't get to them right away, we will get to them at the end during Q&A. I'm sore.
Also, while Peter grabs his coffee, please hit that little thumbs up button or the thumbs down. I really don't care because, believe it or not, they both help out this video because there is 150 of you watching, and only 40 have liked it. But otherwise, while Peter grabs that, I will get us started on our next topic, which is going to be talking just a little bit about some fun base malts that you might not have heard of or just might not think of as using as base malts. These are going to be malts that generally have higher color. They might have some unique flavors. And some of them actually are ones that you might not think of because they're used typically as a smaller percentage, 10-20% adjunct, but actually have enough enzymes in them to fully convert. Somebody says smash it. All right, so let's see here. So the most obvious ones for non-two-row, I guess, base malts. Well, they are two-row, a lot of them still.
Caramel malts, crystal malts.
Pale two-row malts.
Yeah, so non-pale malts is pale ale malts.
With the nomenclature, right?
Yeah.
Most malt is made from two-row barley. But
almost all of it these days.
Yeah, almost all of it, unless it specifically says 6-row. But yeah, when people say 2-row malt, they generally are talking about a general pale base malt. So
yeah, so we're gonna go with anything with a pale ale name, nomenclature-wise, is always going to be that little bit darker version of your basic 2-row. Your 2-rows, your flat white bread, and your pale ale malt is white bread with honey in it. I don't know. What's a good? It's potato bread.
Pale ale.
9 grain? I don't know. No, it's not 9 grain because it's not as grainy.
It's like whole grain.
Yeah, like whole wheat. Maybe not as dark.
Whole
wheat. Comment what you think that type of bread is. Ooh, JT Teller, we are amazing. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. That's awesome.
Thank you, JT.
Don't forget to comment what type of bread pale ale malt is. The pale ale is going to be like your classic Maris Otter.
Maris Otter, like rye bread.
Yeah.
Wait a second.
Oh, that's kind of got its own malt. Maris Otter is going to be your common Maris Otter pale ale that you get that's coming in that 3 Levabond range. So it's going to actually add some darkness to it. Great Western has one called their Northwest High Color Pale. And that one's also in that 3 Levabond range. And it actually does, if you use it as a single base malt, it has a rich amberish hue. Anything that says pale ale or British pale ale is going to be slightly oranging your beer if it's used as a base malt.
Yeah, these guys are generally going to be a couple Levabond darker than typical base malt, but also add fantastic flavor profiles to your beer in a subtle way too, nonetheless. So Maris Otters, and then we use, like Peter said, Northwest Pale Ale malt. So anything with the nomenclature of pale ale malt in it is going to be darker. And then so for flavor wise, I'm still on the bread thing right now.
Yeah. I mean, there's also pearl malts that kind of fit in the same category as a pale ale malt. So we'll talk about those individually. But again, let us know what kind of bread. Is it going to be like? So I mean, it's got to be like one of those like honey or what's the slightly dark and sexy sweetness? It can still be made with white-ish flour, right?
Because this is a video we did a long time ago, but for like the Maris Otter malt, I call it a slight Teddy Graham flavor, right?
Maybe just toasted bread, slightly toasted bread.
Maybe slightly toasted bread. Yeah, I think that could for the Northwest Pale.
You missed the bread. So if you got regular white bread and you missed it with water, and then you put it in a toaster, that's what this is. Let's talk about some other ones. So one that we've talked about the last couple of weeks that is like surprisingly dark, it has a huge color to it, is the Chevalier Heritage Malt, which is another Maris Otter style. But these heritage malts that are slightly higher protein actually react a little bit differently during the kilning process.
So these ones create usually just a really, really rich biscuity flavor profile to them. Kind of like the Teddy Graham on steroids. In fact, that was it was the Maris Otter
1823, yeah.
Jinx. But yeah, between that one, the Chevalier malt, what was the other malt that we were playing with from Chris recently?
That was a Chevalier. No, they've got the number 19, the floor malted.
Yeah, and they've got the floor malt. There's so many Maris Otters we have in stock right now.
Yeah,
it's
we've got
a little overwhelming.
Yeah, and then Halcyon and Pearl are also. I mean, those are we use Halcyon and Pearl in a lot of our malt bills. Halcyon's going to be on that lighter end of the spectrum, but still darker than like a pale two-row. And then that Pearl malt is probably in that same color range as like the Chevalier Heritage, where it has, if you use a single malt of the Chevalier Heritage or the Pearl, you'll have an almost amber hue to your beer.
Yeah, and these can range too. You know, it's so I guess the range is from that sort of Teddy Graham range. Sometimes you can pull a little bit of sweetness. Sometimes you can pull a little bit of nuttiness from them. Maris Otter malts are really known for having like a really subtle nut flavor profile to them. And which who doesn't want to put in their mouth?
Yeah.
And then on the other end, you've got more along the lines of those biscuity, those slightly toffee flavors even.
Yeah.
I would say to
sometimes they can have
ones.
like subtle fruit notes too.
Yep. So heritage malts are a fantastic malt, almost always going to be darker in color. You will probably get slightly lower utilization from them, so you might have to add a little bit more to your grain bills, but you will get a really nice mouthfeel as well because of that higher protein content.
Yep. And so they're great to use. If you haven't played around with some heritage malts, if you haven't tried different base malts, base malts are my favorite way to build complexity in beer before thinking about, I've got my 8 pounds of base malt and then all the different crystal and whatever malts that I put in there for complexity. Start with just learning some really great base malts and have those be a go-to. It'll simplify your thinking process when it comes to brewing beer. Let's go on to Munich and Vienna malts. We won't talk too much about these because we did kind of go over them in the beer of the week. But Munich Vienna malts are base malts, if we didn't make that clear. You can use them 100%. They are self-converting, and they can convert probably 15 to 20% of, what are those called? Adjunct malts, non-base malts, supplementary malts, whatever they're called.
So always add 30% crystal malts with these.
Thomas Groskery, Heritage Grains, woohoo!
Make sure you do crystal 150 with them.
Thomas Croskery is the guy that you guys have seen on this channel opening up Emerus Fermentation Project, and I believe he plans on using all the heritage grains, or at least all local stuff.
Should I report him? Just like, it's like, thanks guys, you got me banned. All right. So yeah, back to Munich and Vienna malts. These guys are going to give you a lot of color. Like Peter mentioned earlier, Munich's going to give you this crazy almost orange color to a beer. You can almost always tell when a beer has almost 100% Munich malt to it, because it does. It has this distinctly orange hue, where Vienna is going to be more subtle. Vienna is quite a bit lighter typically. There can be some darker Viennas out there. But Vienna is usually going to give you this really nice subtle sweetness to a beer.
Yeah, and without really being detracting. So it's different than building color by adding adjunct malts or supplementary malts.
I think a good example actually is I prefer to use a higher percentage of Vienna malt, especially in say like a hop forward beer, compared to a lighter colored crystal malt. So instead of a crystal 20, for instance, throwing something out there,
just do a high percentage of Munich or
yeah,
Vienna.
so I'll use maybe twice the amount of a Vienna malt. So.
Yeah, and a Vienna is less perceptible than you think, but it does add complexity, which is really nice. Scott S says, since I forgot my coffee, he can't like the video. It's a really good point. Forgetting the coffee or to start the coffee is truly a sin. I agree with you there, but go ahead and give this video a thumbs down then, just to kind of make up for it. Let's go into biscuit malts. Biscuit malts, people don't know that most biscuit malts, at least all the ones that are 20 level bond and below, are actually still self-converting.
Yeah, these are going to be your aromatic malts, your Victory malts. Is Victory below?
Victory's right at 20, but Victory can self-convert.
It's right in that range. There's other
general
malts. Yeah, general malts
biscuit
that are
malt.
just labeled as biscuit. I know there's like Best Malt just makes the biscuit malt.
Yeah.
But yeah, these guys still have enzymatic power. Speaking of Thomas Croskery, he found that out an interesting way where he threw some in his yard and it actually sprouted.
Nice.
So yeah, he was very surprised by that. And these guys, if you use them 100%, you will get a very, very strong, very, very distinctive flavor to the beer. And so it's not always going to be appropriate. Obviously like Victory, you will get what we call
very
a V-bomb. Yeah, it will taste like slightly burnt toast.
Yeah, the first time you do 100% Victory malt beer is when you give up your V card. I think that's how it works.
That was terrible.
Someone asked about Caravienne. Caravienne is not self-converting because part of the process goes through under moisture, and it actually does caramelize the sugars in the grains. It doesn't work.
So it's
while we're in this, Red X. Somebody's already talking about Red X.
Yep, and Red X would fall into that biscuit category, and that has a fantastic flavor and can be used 100%.
And it's super colorful for its color.
Super colorful, really rich flavor profile.
Yeah.
So usually we don't use it 100%, but there's no reason why you can't. It does create a really, really deep rose. Dark rose color is the only way I can describe it.
Yeah,
so.
It's a really nice malt. Actually, the first time we tried 100% Red X beer was from Thomas.
Yeah.
When he was working at Bellwether.
I remember that now.
Yeah.
So I've done several of them since.
That pretty much covers basically all the biscuit malts, all the standardized base malts that can add a lot of color to your beer that you can use up to 100% in your beer. I did throw one other one out there that is a little bit lesser known, just as kind of by the way, this thing also exists, and that is Purple Egyptian Barley.
Which is one I have failed on. God, I need to redeem myself on that one of these days.
All you needed to do is a step mash. You did a step mash.
No, I needed to not use 100%.
I would have used 100%. I want to use 100% and do a step mash. I guess now we have Visco Buster and Optimash, and so we've got so many ways to change the game over how we brewed back then.
Yeah, actually, if you would have used enzymes, that would have been fine.
Yeah.
Purple Egyptian Barley is a fun one. It actually
that's cheating though, I guess, because if it's 100%, then it's not a base malt if you got to use enzymes. Step mash. We'll go with the step mash.
Purple Egyptian Barley actually makes the beer purple. And this is a crazy colored beer. Also adds a really, really intense earthy flavor profile to it, which works really well in kind of a wheat beer style, I guess. And so it's a really fun one. I tried to use it 100% once. And I just didn't get the conversion, and I ended up tossing it because I had 40% conversion or something really low. And I think the reasoning behind that
super high protein content
was it was like sand. I tried to do it in the mash and boil, and the
Yeah,
water just
just went
kept
through.
draining through. And I think it does have lower enzymatic power to it, which is what Joel told me. He's
It has enough to self-convert, though.
Yeah,
it's got about
usually
as much as
uses,
Victory.
I
But
think he said 60%.
It's got as much enzymatic power as something like Victory, but it's also higher protein, so you're getting like worse. You're getting more beta-glucan, smushing, all that. Connor Williams, the moment you realized Genius Brewing stream started a while ago. Whoops. It's all right, Connor. You can make it up to us by hitting the like button.
And but yeah, it is a fun one, and I think adding just a little bit of extra enzymes, if you're using something like a mash and boil, and or just doing an extended mash, would probably be fine too. But yeah, I think busy in the shop doing other stuff and didn't realize it until after the beer was already brewed, and then I went, oh, that's like 10:28.
Maybe I shouldn't have whoopsied as much as I whoopsied. Yeast in the Beast says, I didn't know about purple Egyptian barley. Cicerone certification revoked. He was on the stream yesterday with us doing the Cicerone test.
Nice.
That's right. You cannot serve a single drop of beer from now on, legally.
So, so that is purple Egyptian barley and some other fun malts. Is there any other malts you can think of, Peter?
Yeah. Not that I can think of off the top of my head, but if you guys have ideas out there of other malts that you want us to talk about that could be 100% self-converting, could be considered base malts, or if you just want to talk about how we can use Crystal 50 and use a lot of enzymes to make that 100% self-converting. Totally cool.
100%. Carapils.
100%
Carapils.
100% carapils. Yeah, with just
depending on the carapils, it might actually still convert. It shouldn't, but it might.
I know the dextra pills. So something like
I doubt the dextra pills
most of
will.
them shouldn't because it's glassified. It's the same process. They lose the enzymatic power because of the moisture going into the kiln. It goes
that
wet
Link
grain into
one
the.
didn't seem to be very glassified though.
That's true.
That one might actually convert.
That might be
a little mini experiment to do.
Yeah, I was gonna say that might have been more of an oopsident on the malting process.
But it does have a fantastic, just like really subtle honey flavor. Anyway, we are going off on tangents now, and let's start answering some questions for you.
Someone's already thrown out Dark Munich 25 to 30L. Dark Munich still has some enzymatic power, but I kind of cut it off at if I'm confident it will 100% self-convert, i.e. you can do a smash with it. And I don't believe you can do a smash with something that dark.
Opal. I think we used that a while ago, didn't we?
I used to bring in all the Thomas Fawcett ones.
Yeah, Opal is a fantastic base malt.
And super flavorful. All those named Thomas Fawcett malts are actually really good. Halcyon is still the best by far. It's my favorite. You should all use it.
All right, you going from the top or the bottom?
I'm going from the top. Started from the top. Now I'm here. Why does it
we'll
want
meet
to?
in the middle?
That's right. We'll meet sandwich in the middle.
All right.
We got some Portland people. Morning from Spokane.
Wait, I thought you were starting from the bottom.
I'm starting from the top. Started from the top. Now I'm here.
I'll
just like the Drake song. Jimmy, we still need to drink your barley wine on camera next week, maybe.
Well, all right. So we got Max says every time he tries to lager a beer on the yeast, he gets a green apple flavor. Doesn't taste it during primary, but it always happens after lagering. Any thoughts?
Use that conditioning phase I talked about.
Yep, I would say use that conditioning phase. And it sounds like your yeast might be getting stressed out a little bit. The green apple is acetaldehyde, which sometimes can happen from actually yeast autolysis, which means that your yeast are dying and the cells are popping.
Well, it happens from yeast pseudo-making alcohol.
Yeah.
And it also happens from them. Some yeast can actually convert alcohol back into acetaldehyde, but usually that's a pretty quick process to reconvert. So generally speaking, when I think of acetaldehyde, I think of some sort of re-fermentation, which can come from yeast giving up their lives for other yeasts to eat.
Yeah, but it can come from a few places, but generally speaking, it means that there are excessive stresses on the yeast at some point, which means that they're not finishing their job. So I would just say, do the whole rules of trying to oxygenate and keep healthy big pitches at your beer, because there's no reason why that should be there if you're lagering on the yeast. So
Patriciu Konstantin Popovici, definitely nailed that name. Made a Vienna Lager with only Weyermann Vienna malt, had low efficiency, used Tettnanger 30 and 3470. It tasted good only after 3 weeks of maturation. My friends loved it. I was not impressed. I would try a step mash in that next time. If you had low efficiency, try a step mash, see if you can get some proteins out. Weyermann's usually pretty good about being highly modified, so the storage of the malt might have also played a role somewhere in there. But if you try to step mash, that would cure a lot of things.
I mean, it's hard to say if you're if you don't know what you're not impressed with, too.
Yeast and the Beast, cone to cone, talking about the yeast starter that we were talking about at the beginning. We have a 14-gallon unit tank, and so we'll build up our yeast starter, basically just making a small beer in that. And we make the yeast starter for that small beer in a 5-liter Erlenmeyer flask like normal people do. And then we build it up in there, add a lot of oxygen, and then we have 10 gallons that'll go into our 7-barrel batches.
Ben is asking about options for rye malt in something like a rye PA as not necessarily a base malt, he says, but or maybe as a base malt. He says not a self-converter, but I like the differences and options for, say, a rye IPA. You could potentially use 100% rye. You definitely want to use all those enzymes to help you out, though, because rye turns into a brick.
It'll turn into a brick. Yeah, you need the Visco Buster. Rye malt does have enzymes, and it's kind of self-convert. It's not as enzymatic as wheat or barley, so I don't know if it'll 100%. But you could use a high percentage. The flavor might be a little bit extra if you did that, though, so I probably wouldn't. Your other option besides using, like, let's say 15 to 20% rye malt is using something like 10 to 15% flaked rye.
Yeah.
And flaked rye has that better pumpernickel flavor right off the bat, and also gives you some fluffiness.
Yeah, and I honestly think, throwing some flaked rye into other than the color, because it has this sort of weird gray color to a beer.
Yeah.
Other than the color, throwing it into like a sort of hazy recipe might work really well if you've got your hop styled in there. Adding them with I think a good example would be when we use the South African hops.
Yeah.
Like I can actually see something like that playing well with South African hops, and 20 to 30%.
Yeah, I can see that.
So
getting a little bit extra that pumpernickeliness.
Mm-hmm.
Ricardo, I'm hesitant on using phosphoric acid now. Last beer smelled farty. Phosphoric acid shouldn't have been the cause of that unless it was something to do with yeast activity in regards to the pH. Extra low pH can stress the yeast out. So if you're using a lager yeast and the pH is too low, I guess that could produce some sulfur.
Sulfur is probably just from the fermentation, though. A lot of lager yeast will throw sulfur during the fermentation, and the good news is, for the most part, that goes away. You just got to give it a little time.
Yeah, or if you do some CO2 scrubbing, basically bubble up through your beer,
that can
you should be able to get rid of that.
Yeah,
but I don't, off the top of my head, know why it would have necessarily come from phosphoric acid. Thank you so much for the super chat, though. I appreciate that. That is awesome, and it makes us feel good.
Is Viking Red the same as Red X? How much per 5 gallon would you need to get the color? Not familiar. I know Viking malts. I'm guessing they make.
So I know that I know Red X is a proprietary.
Yeah, so it's not the same. My guess is that they're trying to get you in that same ballpark of a high color base malt. Do you know what the Lovabond is?
Looking it up.
Peter's looking up the Lovabond. But yeah, Red X generally falls. Red X is right around 10 now.
Recommended usage 20% of the grist. And so it's definitely not going to be the same. Designed to have it's rich in melanoidins, has a dark color. It enhances color and aroma. So it's got a really nice red color, but doesn't seem like it's a self-converter.
That honestly sounds more like Karastan to me, or the Kara Red.
Kara Steam.
Yeah, even that. It sounds like a darker color, so I would not say it's the same as Red X.
Yeah, I would say it's more like what used to be Sacra 50, now Kara Steam.
Yeah.
Malt data sheet.
Yeah, because the Karastan's like 35L, so.
Yeah.
But yeah, that sounds more like a Kara Red to me, so probably not going to be comparable to Red X.
Moisture, yeah, it has nothing on enzymes on it, so.
All right.
Yep, would not use it as a substitute for Red X.
Single malt for an orange. Has anybody heard about cold IPA? What? What is that? No.
Cold IPA?
I mean, most IPAs are cold.
Enlighten us.
Enlighten me.
Hey, we're going to be the first people in Spokane to know about it.
Yeah, now I need to Google that. Has anyone...
Should I expect flavor differences from avoiding all clarifying agents, specifically Werflock versus no Werflock? There is a small flavor difference between Werflock and no Werflock. That said, you build your beer around it. If you're used to using a clarifier, you just kind of build your beer around what the final beer is going to turn out with it. So having a stripped character doesn't necessarily mean having a worse beer or a less flavorful beer. You just kind of learn to brew, clear beers that way. And any sort of clarifying is going to have kind of the same effect. You are reducing the number of proteins that end up in your final beer. So if you're looking for something that's clear for a reason, then use the clarifiers. If you're looking for something that's not clear because you want that proteiny kind of flavor, then don't.
We got a question from T-Man, which, he's probably not going to get a good answer from me, but he's asking for what the best ratio is of two-row to Maris Otter, and that can be literally any ratio. But my honest...
100% Maris Otter.
Yeah, my honest thing is going either one or the other. I think if you're going to use Maris Otter, use Maris Otter as your base malt.
And if you're looking for a blend instead of using one or the other, instead of trying to blend it right, just use Halcyon.
Yeah. So, I mean, two-row is nice because it's really neutral. But you got to realize that Maris Otter malts are still pretty subtle in their flavor profiles. So, and I've seen recipes like this all the time. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, different Maris Otters tasted like Maris Otters are a broad category too.
Yeah.
So, like Baird's Maris Otter is super neutral. It's almost as neutral as our two-row that we have here. It's probably less neutral than our Northwest Pale Ale malt.
Yep. For sure. But yeah, I would say either go with the flavor that you're going for or just use two-row as your base malt. I don't see the point in doing 60% two-row and 40% Maris Otter. I think at that point, it's such a small amount of the Maris Otter, you're not going to get that effect you're looking for. So.
Yeah. I would say switch up your base malt to the base malt that's right for you instead of trying to blend your own base malts.
Yep.
There's a handful of times that I will try to blend, but that's just because I know my base malts really well that I carry. But I would try out something like Halcyon and see how that does for you.
Speaking of base malts, can you use wheat malt as a base? And
yes,
you sure can.
People made 100% wheat.
Yeah, people do brew in a bags a lot with it. It sort of has a similar effect to rye, where it tends to sort of glob up on you. So if you plan on using it 100%, you're probably going to need to do a slightly extended mash time. And if you're using a traditional mash tun, you might have to add a bunch of rice hulls in there to help fluff it up, just because it's not going to have any of that from the barley that you're typically using. But yeah, you can use it 100%. It makes for a very chewy beer. So,
Jiri Okonen says, what is the best single thing to take into account while trying to achieve crispness? How do you make a crispy boy? I'm going to say water chem.
Yep, that's what I would have said too. Water chem and probably mashing would be the next thing.
Yeah, mashing, getting the right mash technique.
Yeah.
Water chem is going to be first and foremost. You want a little bit of calcium. Generally speaking, if you have a low mineral profile and a slightly high sulfate content, pretty similar to what we have today, actually. Overall low minerality, that's going to help avoid haziness, honestly. So low bicarbonates. Then that's going to help you create that crispy boy. And then that mash temperature, making sure you're not having extra beta-glucans, high dextrins, haze-forming starches, or proteins that end up in your final beer. That thing is going to be a dry, crispy boy.
All right. Sounds like it's done. We got Matthew Perez is asking... He says he brewed a Saison 5 days ago, and the OG is sitting at 1.000, but wants to pitch OLY 061, which I'm not super familiar with, to help it along. But it sounds like it's pretty much there.
Is 061 the tropical IPA?
I don't remember.
Which would be Sactois.
I would say it's already done its thing, and it's not going to drop more than another point or two, if that. It sounds like it's done to me if it's at.
If you want more, add some
1.000. Yeah.
Oh, 1.000?
Yeah. It's like, no, that beer's done. Maybe it's a typo. I don't know.
Maybe.
But yeah, if it's at 0, then there's not much sugars left. All right.
If you take that Wiener malt into your mouth, you'll have a happy Valentine's Day. Wiener malt is great, and we do like best Wiener malt.
A traditional German, or at least what do you call that, sort of mainland European Vienna malts, in my opinion, is always going to have more flavor, more complexity over a domestic or United States Vienna malt. So
yep,
United States or I guess
T-Man, thank you so much for the super
too.
chat, T-Man, and go Steelers.
Go Steelers. Honey wheat.
Did we ever get a consensus on what kind of bread that was?
No, we never did. New to brewing, for a golden ale extract, doesn't need to be transferred to a secondary fermentation vessel, from Eli Hernandez. And no, definitely no need for that, unless you're like adding fruit. That's usually the only time I use secondary. is to transfer onto some fruit. So I would say don't worry about secondaries. Those are kind of a thing of the past. We got Jump Jasper is asking about Pilsner malts for hazy. Yeah, I mean, straightforward one there. Pilsner malts are almost always the go-tos for hazies, just to keep that color light. And that's really it. But like Peter said, Halcyon is also a really nice pale malt that adds a little more complexity than a Pilsner malt. So don't be afraid to reach out and try some other malts that aren't necessarily Pilsner if you're going to get a little better flavor. I would say keeping that color range of like below 3 Lobobon sound reasonable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anything that's like 3 or below, and you'll be good for a hazy, as long as it's not getting super dark. Best base malt for a hazy. Oh yeah. Okay. So we already answered that.
Halcyon.
Halcyon. Yeah. Oh, Peter, did you say Halcyon?
I haven't said Halcyon yet. Funky Brewer asks, Peter, how do you drink your coffee? Caffeinated and laced with cocaine.
Hey, and we are all caught up on ourselves.
Scoot down.
Scooting
All right, let's go
down
back down to the bottom and see what we can find.
to the bottom.
If people are loving my coffee ASMR, you're welcome.
Perfect. Oh, thank you, Ricardo, too. I didn't even see the super chat. Sheesh.
I did. I commented on it. Are you guys Seahawks fans? Just curious. I'm a fan of it in the fact that it makes a lot of people around me excited when they're winning. So I honestly don't follow football very much. And Logan doesn't follow football at all.
I mean, yes, I do. I watched like a third of the Super Bowl before I realized it was really going nowhere. Yeah. Some people kick balls with their feet. And enzymes are definitely not necessarily to make an easy pale ale with 2-row malt, which is a question from Scott S. And he says he's sorry he was a jerk. I'm sure.
Oh, I think that was because he was saying that he's going to thumbs down us for me not remembering my coffee.
Oh, okay. Sounds good.
It was a joke.
I'm like, okay. But yeah, no, 2-rows are generally, or 2 pale malts, I should say, are generally so high in enzymes that you shouldn't have to add anything extra unless you want to do like a brute IPA or something like that where you're getting kind of crazy with it. But yeah, for a pale ale, I don't see any reason unless you're getting stuck mashes or having some other brewing issue. Cocoa nibs, tincture or straight in? I prefer straight in.
Straight into secondary for the aroma, straight into the whirlpool for the flavor. USMC Mike 1. Thank you so much for the super chat. We appreciate that. That is awesome. We've had a lot of people supporting us today. That feels good. Makes it worth getting up in the morning.
All right.
Century Rye. Thomas, you need Savisco Buster or Ultraflow Max. Yeah, you do, Thomas. I'm betting Thomas made that 90% rye beer like before he knew about those enzymes, though. Probably a while ago.
Might have even been before those enzymes existed.
Might have. Thomas has been doing weird stuff for a long time.
For a long time. I mean, without Thomas, I wouldn't have grown an entire garden bed of, what was that, like
lemon basil? Yeah.
Oh, God, it makes me nauseous thinking about it.
Should yeast nutrient always be used for lagers, and do you like nutrient for all your beers? So yes and no. Nutrient's always a good idea for yeast starters in general, basically, making sure that they're heavy and active. That said, lagers are probably one of the easiest things to make sure are fermented without a yeast starter. I do pretty consistently try to use yeast starters just in general. So I would say yes, but are they necessary? Absolutely not. Simple beers that are low starting gravities are really easy to ferment. Risks of not using a pH reading in brewing. That's a hard one for me to answer because we usually don't. We just we know our water and we know our mashes. So we've taken enough pH readings that we don't need to. Risks are going to be if your pH are too high or too low in the mash, you can lose enzymatic activity. That said, step mashing actually takes care of a lot of that, and we usually do a step mash. So the short answer is there's a way around it if you never ever use a pH meter.
Yeah, and I would say before you invest in a pH meter, invest 5 minutes by looking up, doing some quick research into the local water around your area. And odds are, if you call up a local homebrew shop, if you talk to somebody else that's brewed a little bit, they're already going to have an idea to say like, oh yeah, our water's crazy alkaline. You got to add a little bit of acid or oh yeah, I don't have any problems. So that's probably going to be the easier way to find that out.
Funky Brewer, if the pH of my stout is within a good range, would it still be beneficial for the beer to increase bicarbonates, even though that would increase the pH afterwards? Kind of depends. So different yeasts will actually produce different levels of acidity during fermentation. If you're doing a stout, if it's a very roasty stout, I would say always increase bicarbonates, generally speaking, because that roast and that bicarbonate tend to create a nice synergistic mouthfeel. But if you're using something like the Irish ale yeast, which actually creates a little bit more acidity than a lot of other yeasts, then it would probably be beneficial. If you're using something like, I don't know, a lager yeast or something like that, I'm just spitballing off the top of my head, then it might not be the best idea. But I can never see it really being a bad idea unless you go too overboard.
Can we package up Ultra Max Flow into a pill form?
Yeah. What is a better method of fermenting under pressure? Letting it go for a few days and then cap it, or cap it from the get-go and spun? Curious about yeast stress. We usually let it go for a few days, let it get through most of its fermentation, and then cap it. We sometimes pressure ferment. If you have a proper spunning valve and you can set it to 8 psi, the yeast stress, depending on your fermenter, probably won't be that big of an issue, and it can ferment pretty neutrally. But we like the idea of a more neutral fermentation, or a more open fermentation, especially in conicals, just so that we don't also get a bunch of yeast trying to stick to the cone.
All right. We got John Yoke is asking if Super Bowl is a big deal for the craft beer industry in America, as well as the big guys, and really no. It's definitely a big player thing, mostly because what is the cost on a commercial? It's like millions per second or something that is way out of the reach of even the larger craft breweries.
We're going to buy one next year, so we'll let you know.
Yeah. Super chat us for $30 million, and we might be able to get a 10-second ad.
Yeah. What is the maltiest malt?
The maltiest malt? That's loaded.
Crystal 60.
The maltiest malt. I'm thinking of malted milk duds. I want to go honey malt.
Honey malt's actually good. That's pretty good. Yeah, I wouldn't use too much honey malt.
Honey malt's really easy to overwhelm a beer with.
Someone is from Scotland and wants to know, what can they use to darken their skin? They are very white. So first of all, you're going to want to eat a lot of carrots, like way too many carrots.
What?
And then you're going to want to go and you're going to want to change all your lights in your house to those UV tanning bed lights.
I was going to say, there you go. I was like, just get yourself a tanning bed.
And the lots of carrots.
And carrots.
Lots and lots of carrots.
All right. Oh, now I lost my place on here. Sorry, probably going to miss a few questions.
Is there a table? A lot of people are asking about water chemistry. We use the water chemistry calculator from Brewer's Friend.
Lars has a good question. Is there a sort of practical lower boundary on mash temperature? I think he's talking specifically about saccharification rests. And he said is 146 good, or is that too low? 146 is actually a pretty common mash temp for us to start in, and you're not gonna get a lot of conversion if you get below. It kind of depends on the malt too, but you can get down all the way to pushing that 140 degree mark. And still actually get some saccharification conversion. With that said, if you mash in lower, you're not necessarily denaturing those enzymes, so you can always raise that temperature up through the range to get that saccharification. So that's honestly, that's part of the reason why we always try to shoot low, because it's a lot easier to adjust that versus overshooting your mash temp and risking denaturing all those enzymes. Oh, now it just jumped down on me.
I'm not sure what I need to change to make it better. Are there questions I should ask myself next time to review? Soren Brockdorf made his first beer, and it was an oatmeal stout. He said it was better than he expected, but not great. And what questions should he ask myself when he reviews it? Things that I would ask myself in an oatmeal stout specifically are, first of all, and with any beer, are there any pungent off flavors? Are there any pungencies that don't feel like they belong? With an oatmeal stout, I'd also say you want to ask yourself if there is a distinct slickness on the tongue. There should be a distinct slickness from the oat oils if you did them right. So 2 things that I would do. If you had $30 million right now, what would you do? Retire. I would get the heck out of this business, and I would just go and take my family and leave.
And go to a strip club.
I'd probably still do the YouTube stuff. I just don't think I'd do the business side.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. But I want to spend a lot more time with my family. Yeah, that's about all. Intertap or Nuka-Tap? Depends. So I would say Nuka-Tap for most everything, except for Intertap can also sometimes be better for bars just because they're thicker.
Yeah. They both actually work really well. I would say whatever you can get a hold of these days, because the supplies of them are hit and miss.
Yep.
All right. Kevin says his beer usually finishes within 4 points of OG. I'm guessing FG. Within 3 or 4 days, and he raises the temp for 3 or 4 days. Is that normal, or does a 4-day rest impact the flavor? So I would say, I think he's talking about FG. And I would say if you're within, say, 20% of your final gravity, then raising that temp up to finish up a beer shouldn't hurt it at all. If you're worried about, I guess, off flavors from a higher temperature fermentation. But yeah, I would say that's pretty normal especially for lower alcohol beers. With the pitches we're getting these days, if you're doing a starter, if you're pitching, something like Imperial where you're already getting twice the cell count, then those really rapid fermentations are actually more common than not.
Yeah. And in terms of the high temperature stuff, I wouldn't leave it at the high temperature for too long, but you're really not risking anything with 3 or 4 days. I'd try to aim for 2 to 3, but is it too late to, T-Man asks, is it too late to oxygenate after day 1 with no activity? 20-gallon batch testing 4 yeast strains. No, it's not. Yeah. Even with high gravity batches, I mean, depending on the gravity of the beer, you can keep oxygenating up down to, I want to say, like 20 to 30% of the sugar depletion. So you want to make sure that there's still, obviously, sugar in there to re-scrub that out and not get off flavors. But with high gravity beers, we'll purposely oxygenate 1 to 2 to 3 days after pitch just to make sure that yeast really gets going.
Ooh, here's a great question from Corbin asking what the best way to prevent suck back while cold crashing is. And it depends on your fermenter. If you got a nice fancy conical fermenter, you can actually hook it up to CO2 and put a couple PSI pressure on it, which is ideal because any leaks that you do have will be to the outside and not on the inside. Otherwise, a very tried and true method, which we've actually used before, is the classic squirt some CO2 into a balloon and then stick that balloon onto whatever the kind of airlock or whatever port you have on your fermenter, and that should keep enough positive pressure on the fermenter so that when it does suck back, it's sucking back CO2 instead of the atmosphere.
Lars asks, if I'm fermenting an IPA at 95 with Voss Quake, should I drop the temp to dry hop or keep it at 95? That to me is going to depend entirely on what stage you are dry hopping in and whether or not you can pressure ferment. If you cannot pressure ferment, what I would say is go ahead and finish that beer out, drop it down, do a cold crash, get it cold, and then dry hop when it's cold. Obviously, everything in a sealed CO2 environment. And then for if you can pressure ferment, then you can also do it more like a hazy and do a biotransformation dry hop. But your risk is obviously the activity at that temperature volatilizing off the oils. So if you do that, I would say it's necessary that you pressure ferment if you're going to biotransformation dry hop using Quake.
There you go.
Hey, and a super chat. You're welcome. Thank you for the super chat. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Lars. Definitely appreciate that. Apparently people are talking about Bitcoin now.
Yeah.
Hey, I got an ROI on my Bitcoin.
Hey, me too. So somebody tipped me in Bitcoin like 4 or 5 years ago, tipped me like $2 in Bitcoin. And I just checked it the other day and it's worth like $300 now. So if only we had known.
I bought 2 super cheap miners this last fall and actually stuck them under my house, and they've been heating my house all winter. It's been great. I bet you I could actually resell them for twice the price now because Bitcoin was like $17,000 then, and I think it was like 48 this morning or something crazy.
Nice. Hayden Hollenbeck says Vossquake can also not biotransformation hops. Yes and no. So every yeast actually does some level of biotransformation, and so it's kind of a misnomer that some yeasts are good for biotransformation and some yeasts are not. So there is some level of biotransformation that will happen even with Vossquake, and it is a very active yeast. And so a lot of what you want out of a biotransformation dry hop, you can still get using Voss.
Well, all right. Quikes can. Yes, most ale yeast can biotransform. It looks like we're actually running out of questions, which is perfect timing because we are coming up on 10 o'clock.
We got to get open. If we miss your question, sorry, feel free to send us a message on Facebook or Instagram. Leave a comment after this video is done or on our other videos, and we will try to get to them. We get a lot of comments these days, and so we are not able to get to all of them, but we will try. Facebook or Instagram is always good. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our second channel, Genus Not Brewing. Our next Will It Beer will be going up on our second channel first to see if that can get more traction than it does on our main channel. So make sure you are subscribed. We're going to be doing some more fun stuff there. Logan's also starting a fishing channel, but he doesn't have anything up there yet. So
I do.
We'll tell that to you in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Well, I might have a video up in 2 weeks. We'll see. I've got a couple I've been editing.
Then we'll have a reason to push people over there.
I'm pretty sure if you Google it, it probably won't even pop up because there's no content.
Nice.
You can try. It's dorsal fishing, so.
Dorsal fishing. Was it very sore? You guys can thank Hayden and Damon for that.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you for all the likes. If you want to support us, please check out genusbrewing.com. We have some awesome swag and recipe kits available on the websites. And otherwise, we do this every week at 8:45 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. With some fun topics for you all. And thank you once again. We will see you next week.